Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the third and final installment of A New Political Reality, our three-part webinar series on new risks and new opportunities for business in the evolving 2025 political landscape. Today, we're focused on helping your business navigate the rapidly changing landscape of our federal agencies and the administrative state. My name is Sarah Bonk, the founder of Business for America. A big thanks to our promotional partners who helped get the word out about today's event: the Business and Democracy Initiative, Citizen Connect, the Fulcrum, Niskanen Center, State Business Executives, and the YPO Democracy Group. If your organization would like to become a promotional partner for future programming, please reach out to our marketing director, Chip York, chip@bfa.us. For those of you joining us for the first time, Business for America is a business membership organization, a national nonpartisan nonprofit, and we focus exclusively on how companies and business associations can help foster a healthy representative democracy, greater bipartisanship, and effective government. Our member companies come from across the country in all different sectors and sizes, from Fortune 500s to small startups. So today, in our final session of A New Political Reality, we are focused on the administrative state. Before we get to our panelists, I want to set a little context, starting with this question. Why does the administrative state, and of course the changes being made by the Department of Government Efficiency, aka DOGE, why does this matter to the business community? So businesses interact with the federal agencies in countless ways. Give you a few examples. The Small Business Administration provides loans and other support to help businesses launch and grow. FEMA offers emergency and disaster assistance when crises strike. A lot of businesses rely on regulatory approvals and licenses from agencies like the FCC, the EPA, the FDA in order to operate legally. The infrastructure we rely on to move goods relies on agencies like the FAA, the Department of Transportation, and Department of Homeland Security. Workforce development programs and unemployment assistance are supported by the Department of Labor. Of course, a business can become a federal contractor selling products and services to the US government. And let's not forget regulations from the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, Security and Exchange Commission, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. I could go on. There's a lot of ways that businesses rely on the agencies in the administrative state. So, the successful functioning of the administrative state is hugely important to American business, our operations, our profit, and therefore our overall economic success. Now, with regard to the new administration, DOGE, and the rapid and dramatic changes that are taking place, there are a few things that most of us can agree on. First, there is a lot of waste and inefficiency in our government. While there's lots of good, there's also a lot that we can improve. This has been documented over decades, and I'm hoping that saying this isn't too controversial. So what we're looking at here is a chart showing the number of federal government programs that the Nonpartisan Government Accountability Office, or GAO, if you've heard of it, they've identified as high risk for financial issues and in need of reform. And that number grew from 14 in 1990 to 37 in 2024. And here's another chart. In 2024, the GAO published two reports that found improper payments made by the US government since fiscal year 2003 totaled an estimated 2.7 trillion, and that number leaves out some large programs. So these improper payments should concern every American taxpayer, and of course, businesses are taxpayers too. As for public opinion, in 2024, this Pew survey here found 56% of Americans say government is almost always wasteful and inefficient. And that majority has held up over time. Of course, they were only given two choices, so they really nailed folks down into one box or the other. But nonetheless, that's been true for a while. More recently, a February Harvard Caps Harris poll found that 7 in 10 voters think that government expenditures are filled with waste and agree with cutting 1 trillion in expenses from the federal budget. So as we can see, a majority of Americans, depending on how you ask the question and when you ask it, but this majority do believe that there is a need to improve efficiency in our federal government. The data support that view. So the challenge for the current administration and the Department of Government Efficiency is not so much the overall objective of reducing waste or the importance of these agencies, but rather how those objectives are operationalized and the impact on our economy and society. The idea of reducing waste and making the government work more efficiently is laudable, but the process by which we attempt to accomplish that is where the difficulty arises. Our expert panelists will be delving deeply into this question today. So, do you and your business need to make some plans or even changes in light of everything going on with DOGE in our administrative state? Probably so. I think we will have some questions and discussion around that as well. Lots for us to think about and discuss today. So thank you all once again for joining us today. And with that, I'll hand it off to Richard Idlin, Business for America's National Policy Director, to moderate the discussion. Richard, take it away.
Great, thank you. And welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We are fortunate to have three very informed and knowledgeable presenters with us today, folks who understand how government works, the opportunities for reform, what is happening with DOGE, and the function of the civil service. So let me briefly introduce those three, and then we'll get into the conversation. Michelle Amante is the Senior Vice President of Government Programs with the Partnership for Public Service. Previously, Michelle had worked with Massachusetts Department of Unemployment Assistance and also spent several years working with the consulting firm Deloitte, where she was responsible for helping to modernize IT processes. Ben Bain is the Director of State Capacity with the Niskanen Center. Ben previously worked for a number of organizations, including Booz Allen Hamilton, the Defense Department, the X Prize, and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And David Super is the Carmack Waterhouse Professor of Law and Economics at Georgetown University, where his research includes administrative law and constitutional law. So we have today really four objectives to discuss. And one is the nature of reforming government, making it more effective and efficient, and changing the bureaucracy. Secondly, what's happening now with DOGE and changes to the federal workforce, and what are the objectives of the Trump administration? Third, as we heard, what are the impacts on the business community and the private sector? And finally, what are some specific opportunities to reform government in a more rational and maybe appropriate manner than is currently being pursued? So Ben, let me start with you if we could. And as we've discussed, there have been a number of reform efforts over the past several decades by other administrations. I'm thinking of the Clinton-Gore effort in the 90s to reinvent government. And the vice president established, I think, 30 working groups and issued a report. And that made some significant difference in reducing the workforce. It seems that the approach that Elon Musk and DOGE are taking is a radical departure from that more orderly process. And maybe you could just start by giving us your understanding of what is the Trump administration's objective in cutting thousands and thousands of jobs in the workforce, dismantling agencies, and what is the big picture objective here as you understand it?
Well, if anybody is listening in and is struggling with trying to figure that out, they're not alone. There's a lot of, I think, things happening all at once here. So I don't think there's one easy answer. So one way I've been trying to look at everything that's going on right now is to split things up a little bit. So there's the actors, there's their actions, there's their intentions, and then the impacts. That's just one frame that we can use, and I'll quickly kind of walk through that. So Elon Musk and DOGE is just, that's, like Elon Musk is just one actor. And then you've got DOGE, which is a kind of a growing mix of people. But then you also have people that are not affiliated with DOGE that are working at each of the agencies or in parts of the White House. And so there's a lot of different people that are involved here. So different power players, personalities, and how that starts to kind of play out. That's a really important aspect to understand who we're talking about at any given time. There's a range of actions and how they're going about doing that. So some things are coming from kind of within the White House or the White House structure, but then some things are happening more at the agency level. And so kind of really understanding where things are happening and specifically what they're trying to do, that's helpful, or just the actions they're taking. The intentions are really hard to understand right now because if you're listening to stated objectives, sometimes the actions and the impacts of those actions are not necessarily aligning where you think that those kind of make sense. So just to give you a sense, there's talk of efficiency. Obviously, that's in the Doge name. Efficiency is different than effectiveness. So I think everybody will have an opinion on what we mean by that here. But if you're just cutting employees, especially the ones that they are cutting right now across many agencies, and you're just trying to check off, dollars saved, that's not the same thing as achieving efficiency. And it's definitely not the same thing as achieving effectiveness, depending on what it is you're trying to achieve. And the way that the bureaucracy is set up is that they are trying to deliver on the laws that are passed by Congress in order to carry out their mission. And so that goes back to intent of, is the administration still trying to, pursue those, or are there some other intentions at play here? And just one kind of other piece, there's a big focus on waste, corruption, and fraud. That was part of, Sarah's kind of opening take on what's happening here in government. That's really not the source of all problems. It's very easy to look at public perception and say everything is waste and fraud. And I don't want to sit here defending the status quo, because literally the team that we have here at Niskanen is about improving government. So there's a significant need to do that. But there's many other, I think I would argue, bigger issues with why government doesn't always deliver on its and kind of doesn't deliver and always get its desired outcomes. There's a host of kind of procedures that have built up over decades. So we call that procedural bloat or procedural cruft. So laws get passed, more laws get passed. You almost never take things away. Policies and regulations build up. This is both inside the government, but also, you feel the impact outside in the private sector. There's deficiencies in tech. So that gets a lot of attention right now of how does government use tech for its own operations. There's a lot of excitement around, Doge may be bringing in some good technology, but at the same time, they've cut some of the kind of highest operating technology teams that were already in existence in the government. So that's like some good and some bad, or some concerning but some promise. There's this lack of feedback loops, which we talk about. So law gets passed from Congress, they throw it over the executive. But if the law that was passed doesn't have great language, it's pretty hard to learn from that and to update that in any meaningful time sense. But then also there's just bad politics and bad policy. So if you get a bad political compromise, or a political compromise ends up kind of confusing a policy, and you deliver that to the bureaucracy to go implement, they don't know how to implement that. And that creates a whole host of problems. So when it comes to what do we need to change in government, yes, waste, corruption, fraud, those exist. We need to be able to address those. And I think that's been covered by a lot of people over decades. But there's a whole lot of other things that are probably, I would say, more important to getting a great government.
Right. Ben, thanks. Say a little bit more, if you would, about the distinction between efficiency and effectiveness. What might be an example of that?
So efficiency is just whatever you're trying to do to do it better or cheaper, to do it faster. But in government, you can't only maximize for efficiency, because government, depending on like what we ask government to do, is to serve all people. There are certain programs that have to serve an entire population of people. And so if you just go for efficiency, and therefore you don't serve the people that are hardest to serve, you could probably become more efficient, but then you're not actually delivering on the mission. So government is different, inherently different than private sector in that case. So if you're a business running a business, you might not go for 100% of your market, because that's not going to be efficient. And you can more kind of just make sure that you're, delivering who you need to deliver to and get the max value for what you're putting out. But in government, you're striving to hit 100% of the people. So, there are programs, for example, just like one comes to mind of us trying to deliver bandwidth, broadband to rural areas. That's really hard. Those are areas that the private sector does not deliver to, because it's not efficient. It's not productive. But the government says this is an important political choice. So they made a political decision to say, we are going to go do this. And therefore it's really hard. And so you're not necessarily, you want to be as efficient as you can, but sometimes that comes up against the fact that government doesn't always have the ability to max that out. So it's not an excuse for waste or being inefficient. Like, we can improve, but it's not quite the same frame of mind of how are we delivering for all the citizens when we need to.
Great. Thank you. I think that's a really important distinction, and one I want to return to throughout the conversation about the possible privatization intention that may be happening here, and moving some of those essential and traditional services that government has provided, into the private sector, possibly. David, let me turn to you and ask you to explain to us whether the processes that Doge is applying are ensuring that the contracting system is adequately managed. And obviously, you know, there are thousands and thousands of government issued contracts and an established procurement system that the private sector relies on. And, you know, there have been many articles written and commentaries made about DOGE not following some standard operating procedures and questions raised about the contracting process within the government. So as you think about administrative law and the rules that govern the procurement and contracting process, what concerns do you have, and what should the private sector be thinking about?
Well, thank you. There is in this country one contract law for the government, for business, for private individuals, that the rules are generally the same. And the rules are that your rights mostly come from what's in the contract. DOGE has put out numerous media reports about canceling this and canceling that. And from what I have seen so far is they have not been very careful about whether they actually have the authority to cancel contracts or not. They've certainly canceled some contracts that clearly do not provide authority for them to cancel, and others where they could cancel for misconduct or failure to perform, but only by giving notice of what that is and an opportunity to correct it. So I'm concerned that this is going to add costs to the federal government in the middle and long term, as businesses no longer regard the federal government as a reliable counterparty to their contracts and start demanding risk premiums. I think the attitude of many businesses up to this point is that the federal government is a pain in the neck, but at least they pay. And this is raising questions about whether they're a pain in the neck who also may not pay when there is a shift in administrations.
And what is your understanding of Congress's responsibility as well as response to these questions?
Congress provides funds through appropriations acts and has long operated on the assumption supported by the Supreme Court that money that is appropriated generally must be spent unless there is specific congressional authorization not to. I mean, an example of that would be the Stafford Disaster Relief Act, where much of the money only goes if there's a presidential disaster declaration. If the president doesn't declare disasters, the money isn't spent, that's all fine. But as a general matter, the Supreme Court held in 1975 that monies that are appropriated by Congress need to be spent by the president. So when you cancel these contracts and don't let new contracts in their place, you are effectively withholding appropriated funds, which is contrary to those appropriation statutes, sometimes the authorizing statutes as well.
And are you seeing examples of, you mentioned that private companies may become reluctant to do business with the government because they're not certain they're going to be paid. Are you beginning to see examples of that from the private sector?
I mean, it's very early, and this government, this administration is working much harder to cancel than to establish new contracts. So I don't think we would expect to see that for a few more months now. And I think people are still, their heads are spinning, things are happening very rapidly. But I think it will fairly soon become known that certain of these contracts have no cancellation authority, and that most businesses are focusing on their own contracts. But to assess the business climate and whether you want to deal with the federal government, they're certainly going to know that some of the companies whose businesses were thrown into chaos by these cancellations had negotiated sound contracts that did not provide for this sort of cancellation, and that as it gets known is going to cause businesses to recalculate what's best for themselves.
And what can you say about the various legal challenges to DOJ's authority, including, the Freedom of Information Act requests, which I see have been ruled upon in the past few days? What are we seeing in the legal area?
Well, we're seeing an enormous torrent of litigation that reflects the enormous torrent of actions Doge has taken. Prior presidents have had something in the government that they really wanted to end or that they really wanted to start, but it's been discrete things. We've never seen this sort of across the board move, except arguably at the end of President Nixon's administration when he was impounding money, refusing to spend money in a wide spectrum of programs and ultimately lost in court. It's too early really to know where these things are going. The only meaningful information, and I'm reluctant even to call it that we have from the Supreme Court was in an emergency application to them in a case involving contracts from the U.S. Agency for International Development. The lower court ordered the administration to make good on its contracts. The administration asked the Supreme Court to intervene. It was briefly put on hold by the Chief Justice so the rest of the court could consider it. And then the court voted 5-4 to allow the lower court to go ahead with adjudicating the case and to refuse to intervene. I don't think you can read a lot into that because the dissent was based on procedural concerns, and the majority's view was that they wanted to see what the lower court was actually going to do. So no one clearly blessed the lower court. No one clearly condemned the lower court on the merits. But our initial indication is that the Supreme Court finds what it's seeing disturbing enough that it's willing to let the litigation play out.
Okay, good. We're going to return to that. Thank you, David. Michelle, let me get you in this conversation. And I know the Partnership for Public Service has been thinking about government efficiency and effectiveness and reforms for quite a while, and has also been very active in responding to workforce reduction cuts, throughout many different agencies. I recall that one of the things we spoke about a while ago was the fact that many provisional employees, younger people, particularly people in their 30s, are those were on the chopping block. And to go back to Ben's point about government, about state capacity and the ability of government to function and deliver services, what is your understanding of the impact that the losses not only of younger workers, but experienced workers, people who've been in the civil service for 30 years, is going to have on the broader economy and on the ability for the private sector to, succeed?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I'm going to tackle it in two different ways. So let's talk about like the talent pipeline for government. Between the fork in the road, the deferred resignations, the shuttering of certain agencies, the closing of certain offices, firing of probationary employees, we're talking about tens and tens of thousands of federal employees that are losing their jobs. Specifically to the probationary period point, so federal employees have a probationary period of 1 to 2 years, depending on the type of job that they serve in. And even sometimes when you transition to one job to another, you could be in a probationary period too. So you could even have experienced federal workers that were in a period of probation. What's particularly disturbing about that is that 27% of those probationary period employers are under the age of 30. And this has been a constant struggle of the federal government, is to try to build that pipeline of young talent. Only 7% of the federal workforce is under the age of 30. And how are you going to build this institutional knowledge, and how are you going to serve the public if we can't get this new generation of talent in? So if you think about, like, why would someone go work for a federal job? And we ask this question to a lot of college students. We do a roadshow every year, And what they tell us is obviously the mission-driven work, right? Like there are jobs that you can do at the federal level that you can't do anywhere else. So like that is really appealing no matter what level you are in your career. So mission-driven work, but also the stability of the job. And even for young people, Gen Z, this is really important to them. They saw their parents through the Great Recession. They understand why it is important to have stability in your career. The federal government no longer provides stable jobs. That is what we are seeing here. So in terms of like what effect does that have? Well, you're already competing against, federal government is already competing against a robust private sector, particularly in certain jobs like tech jobs, healthcare jobs. So they were already struggling in those areas. And now you're losing your stability and you're operating in a very chaotic environment. So it would not be a rational decision for someone choosing between private sector, a stable government, or a stable job at, Microsoft or at a healthcare system versus going into the federal government right now, which feels very chaotic and unstable. So in terms of like what that means for the federal workforce, it's going to have a chilling effect for generations to come. Because regardless of what happens in the next presidential election, what we have seen now is that so many things can be dismantled that we all thought would hold. And so regardless of what happens, like we know that these things can come to pass. How does that affect your constituency? How does that affect the American public? And we're seeing it play out in a lot of ways. So one, again, it is chaotic right now. So there's a lot of transition, a lot of moving around. We're seeing a lot of people with institutional knowledge retire or be affected by the rifts. So when your businesses need to interact with government or you have questions, your contacts may no longer be there. It may be very difficult to find someone to help you. And again, with that institutional knowledge being, leaving, it's going to increase inefficiency. So the frustrations that you may have felt about government will likely increase, at least for the time being, versus decrease. We're seeing it with some businesses where they can't, maybe they can get a hold of their contact, but the federal contract is really nervous to give them any information because they're afraid to say the wrong thing, do the wrong thing, lose their job. So it's creating excessive inefficiency right now with the chaos that is going on.
And who will be hired if there are new positions? What type of person do you think will be willing to take play a role in an agency in the future?
I think it depends on the kind of job. So one other thing that is happening is senior level policy positions that were always career. And that's what you want. You want a merit-based career civil service that is those folks are gonna be your experts. They're gonna stay there no matter who is the president. Those positions are being converted, many of them, to political positions. So again, you have that churn every 4 to 8 years of coming in and out, which is not good one. And then you have the risk of those people not being highly educated or experienced in that specific place. So you've got that aspect of it, and those are at the most senior level careers. At the more junior level careers, you'll have people coming in that aren't necessarily the most qualified or the most experienced, and who certainly aren't looking to make a career in government. This would just be a pass-through stage for them. And that's not always bad. I mean, we believe that government should be more permeable with the private sector, but you don't want 2 million people thinking that way, right? Going back to the stability of government.
Right. Thank you. So that's a sobering assessment of what's happening. With that background, let's turn to discuss what reforms might be adopted. And Michelle, why don't we start with, recommendations Partnership for Public Service has. So you said that you want the employment positions to be more permeable, and maybe people spend some time in the private sector, they come back and serve in government. And I certainly know people who've done that, and they bring with them a lot of knowledge in either case. So when you think about rebuilding a federal workforce, should we have an opportunity to do that, and we don't really know what will transpire over the coming months and years, but if you were to recommend to President Trump, a different approach to increasing efficiency and effectiveness and addressing the waste that exists, what would you recommend?
Well, and I think the one of the positive things that is happening right now is attention to this issue, right? So like the fact that we're having this conversation is good. As Sarah said, like there is a need for reform. I think we're all on board with that, but like, how do we want to do it? So one example is hiring reform. The partnership has long advocated for 20 years that the government's way of hiring talent is inefficient. And this is something that the Trump administration issued an executive order on. So like we will have to rebuild the federal workforce at some point. We will need to have an opportunity to rethink how we bring in talent to make it more efficient. So that is something that we're very focused on and we would love to engage more on. Technology, right? So like is meant to be, or what DOE should be thinking about, right? They basically took over USDS. Like our technology systems are so old, right? 40-year-old systems. Like you want to talk about inefficiency, like that is where you start. And so like, how can we use this opportunity when we've got the attention of Silicon Valley to rethink all of these legacy systems in government that are very inefficient and delay being able to get back to the American public. So that's another area where, again, we have long advocated for reform in that area. I think it is a place where the Trump administration is on board with and wants to see change. Again, it's about how you approach it. Like Silicon Valley's mentality is you just break it. You break it to fix it. It doesn't work in government. If you just break things, like people literally die, right? Like that is not what we want to do. But it is an opportunity to rethink our technology systems. The other place I would make a pitch for is customer experience. Again, this has been a bipartisan area for a really long time. Like, how does government interact with the public? There are a lot of opportunities to make that better. Ben talked about like inefficient rules, build on inefficient rules. Like this is a great example of that, where the government can't even collect real-time feedback from the public because of some, laws that are preventing that. So how do we get real-time feedback and how do we make systems, better for the public and improve the overall customer experience, which will increase and improve public trust in government?
Okay, thank you. Ben, what would you add to that? What reforms is the Niskanen Center thinking or priorities in the near term?
Yeah, it might not be surprising, but we have some pretty similar priorities to the partnership. Late last year, we put out a report, which is a capacity agenda. So happy to share that around with anybody that's interested. But that identifies the 4 priority areas that we think need to be reformed. So somewhat similar to Michelle, but it's hire the right people and fire the wrong ones. So hiring reform, absolutely agree that needs to be fixed. And there's a lot of elements to that. But also, how do we fire poor performers? That is something that every single civil servant that probably, if you have a chance to talk to somebody who's been there for even 6 months, probably, maybe less, they've got an example where, yeah, there are people where it makes it very difficult to try to remove people, but the indiscriminate cuts, especially of the younger people like we're seeing now, is not the way. Then number 2, we talk about invest in, reduce procedural bloat. So that's like that policy cruft that builds up over time. There's a range of ways that we can try to redo things. So the Paperwork Reduction Act, the Administrative Procedures Act, these are all really wonky and nerdy, but this is what stops things. And this is what slows things down. And this is what just creates all these problems why we can't deliver. Following up on Michelle, so we also talk about data and digital infrastructure, super important right now. And then we talk about closing the feedback loop between policy and implementation. So we define state capacity as government's ability to deliver, to actually implement its policies. So the politics and the policies get wrapped around, this is the best way to go solve this societal challenge. And then you make political decisions on how you're going to go about doing that. But once you make a decision, we have to be able to carry it out. And once you do that, the feedback loops just really don't exist. So between the legislature and the executive, when Congress passes a law and they throw it over to some part of the executive to execute, there's not a lot of trust in between those 2 branches. It's usually a hostile relationship to some degree when you do oversight and you're talking about mandates and constraints and why did this fail, and you do public hearings. And so the information does not always go back through there. And it's very constrained information that the executive is allowed to share back to the legislature, because there's this centralized control of not wanting to necessarily give up some of that information. But then there's also these feedback loops in the executive itself. So as things trickle down the bureaucracy, so from the very top down, those feedback loops, that feedback, hey, this isn't working. And so if you just try to like define things at the beginning and just go execute and you never learn from it, you're never really going to get better, and you're probably going to get a lot of bad outcomes. So those are the 4 priority areas, even though those touch procurement, those touch the budget process itself. There's like a lot of these issues that fall under, how do we make the mechanics of government working better?
Right. I'm curious, Ben, are there examples to be drawn from the state level? Are there exemplary practices, procedures that certain state governments have adopted that you would want to borrow?
There's a lot to learn from states. So the laboratory of the nation, right? So you got 50 states that are all doing different things. Just to use, I guess, some states on both sides of the aisle, if you will. There's been some really interesting writing on what's going on in Pennsylvania as one example. And if anybody wants to look up Don Moynihan, he's a academic, but he's writing some really interesting stuff on what's happening in Pennsylvania and how they're improving some of their state capacity. And Governor Shapiro's, I guess, I would say probably famous now for fixing that I-95 bridge fairly quickly, but he just cut through all the cruft and cut through all the rules. He's like, we are going to build this, and it shows it can be done. That practice itself is probably not scalable necessarily, but what can we learn from that example? But then if you take almost any of the states in the South, let's say the red states, where they're getting stuff done. They're building energy infrastructure. They're building housing. There's a lot to be learned by, what does this look like when you don't have that as many mandates and constraints? So everything's a trade-off, everything's a political decision. But if you're looking at the states that are building, many of those examples are red states. And so I think this is happening on both ends that we can learn at the federal level, but it's also so much happens at the state local level. So the federal levels, there's a lot we need to fix at the federal level, but we also need the federal government to make it easier for states to go do all the good things. And so because everything trickles down and the real stuff happens at the state level.
Thank you. David, when you think about the contracting, procurement procedures, and the need for oversight of those procedures, and you want to have a more efficient and effective government, what is the role in the future, you think, of an oversight function? And I'm thinking particularly that the inspector generals, 17, 18 of those were fired several weeks ago, and the oversight capabilities to ensure that the public is getting what it deserves seems to have disappeared in many cases as DOJ has been doing its work and as these changes are taking place. So how do you marry accountability and oversight with the reforms that Ben and Michelle are suggesting?
I think it's challenging, and I frankly think this is going to be a more difficult problem now than it would have been 2 months ago because of what's happened. The system that we've had up to this point in many areas, procurement, policy change, and so on, very much echoing what Ben and Michelle were saying, is fairly complicated rules and then jailbreaks. We either go through a very intricate process or we ditch the whole process and freelance. And the best balance in many instances is somewhere in between, is a less cumbersome process than we've had, but not no process at all. And the inspectors general are a good example of that. They're generally not involved up front, or they don't have to be involved up front, but they come around and say, are we getting what we paid for? Are we executing the policies that we said? And the fear of an inspector general saying what you've done is unacceptable motivates people at all levels of government to improve what they're doing. The message we have here is that kind of soft pressure to do better isn't going to work. And my concern is that we've had such a large jailbreak, if you will, such a large rejection of the rules and so much freelancing that we're going to have abuses. It's inevitable. And that the result is not going to be something like the kind of oversight that the IGs, that GAO, that congressional committees do, but is going to be a straitjacket, which will deal with the abuses that catch the headlines, but slow down and make less efficient all sorts of government processes that are not in
And would you surmise is the rationale for that approach? Is it just a lack of interest in accountability, or is there some more strategic objective here?
I mean, I think the administration is acting on a very ambitious theory of strong presidency, something that is really not consistent with the checks and balances approach that we followed in this country for 200 plus years, but that is much more about a strong president who makes most of the key decisions and has the courts and the Congress in a subsidiary role. And from that perspective, they want everything in a fairly strict uh, uh, line of authority, and the inspectors general are independent in a significant way. Similarly, the judge advocates general in the military who were let go are somewhat independent. They've move to get rid of the independence of agencies like the Securities Exchange Commission, the Federal Trade Commission, Federal Communications Commission, and so on, that have long been held as separate. And the idea is to have this be linearly accountable to the president. We all elect a president, so they should be accountable to that person. Of course, a problem with this is that many of our presidents, including the current one, are not eligible for reelection or not running for reelection. And so there's not a direct opportunity for the public to come in and hold them accountable. And of course, we make decisions about who our president is based on very large issues. And was this president managing government procurement or managing government personnel well or badly is rarely going to be decisive in those elections. So I'm hoping that we can find a way that we can all agree on to restore more accountability on an ongoing basis.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Ben, go ahead.
Well, yeah, just to build off what David said, because this is really interesting, and this happened under the first Trump administration as well. So, there was this sense that the administration was trying to set priorities and goals and wanted to take actions, and then the system was not letting them do that. And it was like stopping them and stymieing them along the way. And so David talked about this like very powerful executive. And so some people are going to take the opinion that they're saying like there's waste, corruption, there's fraud. But then it's pretty hypocritical that now they're getting rid of some of these inspectors and they're like, and then we're not going to do FOIA, we're not going to do all these other things. So people are going to take that perspective. But then at the same time, they're going to say, well, no, this is the only way for us to drive through our priorities because they are finding like non-substantive reasons to stop what we're trying to do because they don't like the end goal, even though we're making a legitimate political, effort. And that the system, the bureaucracy is stymieing us and stopping us for reasons and slowing things down and mucking it up. And so now you've just got this public tension that we see play out, in the election and just happening across our country where people are just seeing the same thing. And there's probably elements of truth to both if you're trying to be as objective as possible. But that's just, at the heart of like some of this real intense friction that we're seeing.
Right, right. And Ben and Michelle, I wanted to spend a few minutes here talking about the strategy going forward and the initiatives that both of your organizations are pursuing, and particularly where the business community might lean in, whether that means working in partnership with your organizations or a project that Business for America might launch, how we work with Congress. So Michelle, why don't you kind of lay out for us, and then I'll ask Ben the same question. Where are we moving from here?
Yeah, and in terms of a strategy, I think we are really trying to spend a lot of time educating the public and educating members of Congress on the impact of these decisions that are being made. Quite often people think of, they think of the federal government, 2.4 million federal employees, and they forget about what that actually means. It's very easy to attack something when it seems faceless and nameless, and it's like, oh, all those bureaucrats. So we're trying to educate the public on like, what does that really mean? Who are these people? And we're actually seeing a lot of outlets pick up on that. You know, the Washington Post and even local news is sharing stories so that you truly understand like what that means, like who these people are and the work that they do. I think what would be really helpful for businesses is to join in that effort of education, right? So when you're talking to your members of Congress, you help them connect the dots. For many, again, it's just they're like, well, we're cutting federal employees. It's, you know, it's like we're making it more efficient. But if you can help them understand how that impacts you, that will make a big difference. Like it'll help them understand the long-term and long-ranging impacts of some of these decisions. So that is a big part of our strategy of a public engagement and really getting people to understand why this is important. But that's a team effort, right? That's not, it can't just be us. It can't be Ben. It's got to be all of us coming together to come to the table and talk about like why this matters now. And again, use it as an opportunity for reform, but hearing your voice is so important right now, because if it's just a bunch of like good government organizations like ours, we can be easy to ignore. But if we get all of you involved in this conversation, it's a different proposition. And so again, like we would love to partner with businesses. We would love for you to be sharing your stories on the Hill to make this this effort and this initiative of engaging the public much more gain much more traction and momentum.
Okay, great. Thank you. Ben, would you like to add to that?
And just in this moment, this is not how I think many people would go about trying to make the government more effective, but we are here, and there has been massive disruption across many agencies. And that means that there's big opportunity as well. And so as we rethink what these organizations are going to prioritize, what they deliver on, there's this just never would have happened under most other administrations. And so that's both good and bad, because we're seeing a lot of harm and impacts that either intentional or not. But then because there's been so much change, there's going to be some opportunities to make things better at a more like structural level that otherwise we would have just been messing kind of like at the very surface level. But from the outside, I think it's about demanding outcomes from government, not policies, not law, but outcomes. So what we mean by that is implementation is key. So don't pat yourself on the back for influencing that a law got passed, because that is not the same as delivering outcomes. So anybody on the outside, especially in the business community, you know, lobbying for certain laws and policies is great and is needed. But if you think that's where it ends, you're wrong. Right. And so you have to demand from the people that you elect, you have to demand from the system that they are delivering on their outcomes. And that's the full range of implementation challenges that we talk about, and that PPS and Niskanen and others represent really well. And so just always think about its implementation plus the law. It's not just the law. And so like as people from the outside are trying to, you know, really make a difference, there's ways they can do that. We can follow up, but it's way more than just, you know, the photo op in Congress and saying that, you know, mission accomplished.
Right. And David, when you think about the contracting procurement process, what what should we be thinking about as far as moving forward? Are there best practices that we should be trying to apply here in the short term, or offering those to members of Congress to consider?
Certainly, and to echo the earlier comments, this is a relatively frozen area on the federal level, but a fairly dynamic one on the state level. Not every state, but there certainly are states that have looked at this more recently and more thoroughly than the federal government. The federal government is bigger than any state. So it's not going to translate over one by one. You can get in trouble doing that. But I think there's a lot of ideas to be had there. There also have been some innovative ideas in the federal government, one of which I was very sorry to see get tossed over the side, was the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, where they arranged it so that the federal government would provide what amounts to seed capital for a lot of green energy infrastructure, but conditioned that on there also being private capital involved as well, and came up with a fairly innovative system involving a fiscal intermediary that would assure that these contracts involve both federal and private capital. And that's all been clawed back and frozen when I think that was an experiment. I was very eager to see how it was going to work out and may not know now.
Ben, let me go back to you, and let's say that the effort on the part of DOGE and the Trump administration is actually to radically reduce the workforce and the scope of services that the federal government's responsible for, and that the goal is actually to privatize many of the services that we have assumed, whether it's NOAA or food stamps or the program David just talked about, and moving those responsibilities to the private sector. Then how are you thinking about sort of rebuilding the state capacity?
Great question. And we've seen this before where, previous reform efforts for the government would say, we're going to do more outsourcing. But then we started to lose a lot of our younger folks. We started to lose a lot of this kind of like the basic, level work, which then people would grow out of and up and out. And then we also lost a lot of our tech expertise. We just gave it up. We said that's the private sector thing, and we are reaping the consequences now. So at the time, it was about efficiency and saving money. This is great. We're going to lower the headcount, but we have a massive system around contractors, which can be fine, but you have to have the internal expertise to be able to effectively say, this is what we're trying to achieve. You are delivering good or you're not delivering good. And therefore, we're going to hold you accountable in order to actually achieve outcomes. So if you want to do more outsourcing, you can't just have nobody on the inside. You have to have very knowledgeable, very specific, very capable people on the outside in order to effectively manage that, almost more so than if everybody's on the inside. And then in some ways that slows things down, because the feedback loop, then, if somebody delivers software, for example, and the people in the government cannot change it, they have to rely on, they send the word over there, the contractor has to change it. Maybe they've got proprietary systems. Whereas if you have the internal expertise and you own the code and you own the ability that the program and actually be able to do that, you just change it and you have a more effective government. So it's significant trade-offs you have to consider if you're going to do more outsourcing, but you have to really consider the internal talent in order to be able to do that well.
I have a friend who spent many years at Booz Allen, Ben, and she reminded me that it's often much more expensive to use, companies like that or Deloitte to deliver the same services that the public sector might. Michelle, let me ask, we have a question from Rebecca Thibault about what's an effective way to collect these stories that you mentioned, and then how to maybe package them, and do you present those to your member of Congress, and in what format? And so could you give us a better understanding of how that process could work?
Yeah, and so one way to do it is to share them with us. So we are, and I can put our website in the chat in a minute. But we are sharing stories. So as you hear stories, if you want to share them with us, we are collecting stories of feds and the important work that we're doing for you yourself. I think if you were able to meet with your member of Congress or meet with a staff member on the team and provide some very specific examples of how that work, the loss of those federal employees, the loss of that institutional knowledge is detrimental to your business, is helpful. Again, like helping them connect the dots. Not all of this is intuitive for members of Congress, depending on their background, how experienced they are in the Hill. So I think you can serve in that. I think, again, making sure they're specific, making sure you're connecting the dots for how the work is detrimental, or how these moves are detrimental to your work could be really helpful. But please, like, share the stories with us as well. We are collecting them, sharing them. Michael Lewis just released a book about, who is government. Like it, we partnered with him on that work, and those stories were part of a Washington Post series. Like, check it out. Like, the stories are amazing. They're inspiring, and they're going to really ground you in the kind of work the federal government does and the employees that serve all of us.
Thank you. And David, when you think about the private sector stepping up to make the business case that Michelle and Ben and you have articulated, um, are there particular functions within the private sector? Is it the general counsel's office, public affairs, corp communication that should be talking about these issues? You know, or because these are not just legal issues, right? So what's your sense of that?
Well, I think it's really all of the above because there are different issues here. There's considerable legal risk if the government is canceling contracts when it isn't permitted to do so. There's going to be a communications concern in that some of these cancellations are being accompanied with very, very negative comments about the canceled contractors that have not so far been supported with any evidence released. And so I think that there's going to be a communications problem to say, no, we are not bad actors. We are doing exactly what we were contracted to do. And if the priorities change, that's one thing, but don't drag us through the mud. And then there's going to be something that perhaps on a higher level needs to be expressed that we're not inclined to contract with people who make it very hard for us to plan what we're going to do. And similarly on the regulatory side, that we're going to be reluctant to enter into new areas where churn in the federal workforce means that we can't get clear answers as to what the regulatory environment is going to be.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I think this point about risk is really important to the private sector. You know, the activities underway are presenting political risk, you know, operational risk, reputational risk, financial risk. And Ben, on that point, and why don't we end here, you know, what is your big recommendation for private companies that may be caught in the crosshairs here, or companies that just find the approach not, you know, not appropriate? Should they be engaging with their members of Congress? Should they be trying to communicate with the administration? What do you recommend?
I mean, if anybody has connections to administration, that's clearly that can be very effective. But absent that, which I think is probably for most people, the most impactful thing you can do is to reach out to all of your Congress people. So your senators, your reps. If you gotta call them, you gotta email them. They respond a lot to all the constituent services. So like it's got to be your representatives or your senators. Say like, this is what's going on, this is the impact, this is what I really care about, you need to do something about it. And then you get your friends and family to do the same thing. I mean, that's just democracy at work. And I think that's still pretty effective of them getting that signal in order to drive action. Because right now Congress can play a lot stronger role in shaping everything that's happening. And their best way, anybody from the private sector, just any person in the country, if they want to shape it, that's probably going to be their easiest, most impactful thing they can do.
Right. Okay. Great. So Ben, Michelle, and David, thank you all so much. Very educational. This has been recorded, so we will be distributing this to all the attendees and those who registered. And a number of links have been put in the chat, and we'll also send a follow-up email with those links. So again, really appreciate everybody's time today. And we have lots of work to do, but I think we are better educated on how to do that. So again, thank you all.